When watching classic media, especially classic films, it can be very easy to see the difference between our modern societal understanding of sex, gender, and performance and the ones being portrayed on screen. With our perspective, it is easy to point out various injustices, sexisms, unfair treatment, and general red flag behaviors that we look down upon in people in our society. What is not so obvious is thinking about the contemporary opinions of the society about their state of being. Is it as obvious to those back then that their everyday lives are enveloped with the task of obeying the man? Did they understand that their society was flawed? Were these problematic social conventions known as a problem? Do progressive accounts of 1940s and 50s Western media identify the problem attitudes from an era of classic films? To put this theory to the test, we will use essays from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. This is the progressive theory of the time that will give us the clue into the mindset that a feminist would have about her society. A Streetcar Named Desire by Eliza Kazan is a 1951 drama rendition of the original play written by Tennessee Williams. If we want to see expressions of characters in this era displaying their gender roles and identities, why not look at some of its classic and popular media? Both the script by Tennessee Williams and film adaptation by Eliza Kazan will aid greatly in this process. Streetcar highlights three main characters: Blanche, Stella, and Stanley. I chose this movie because we have a husband and wife, and our new in town character, Blanche, who has come to make things a little more claustrophobic in their already small apartment. If today I am to act as the expert on de Beauvoir, we will need representation for the background of Tennessee Williams' play and the Eliza Kazan movie. For this, I've prepared research of the movie to help us in our analysis. It might be difficult to keep up as these ideas and media interact, so I have some manipulatives to help us both in our initial exposition and character introductions, and in the analysis of lines, scenes, and character relationships as we move through the story and build on ideas with de Beauvoir. Before we get down to analyzing the main scenes and events of the story, we need to analyze our characters' expositions to gain background. These characters may have qualities described by de Beauvoir or in our research. Our first character is the character who opens our movie, the stranger coming to town. This is Blanche Dubois, Stella's sister, who she is coming in town to visit. She is immediately put in a vulnerable situation, being a woman unaccompanied by a man in an unfamiliar city. She also shows unfamiliarity with her location by having to ask two strangers, till finally she finds Stella at the bowling alley. At first, we get a joyous interaction to have found someone familiar. Then, we immediately see her confronted with violence when she makes it to the bowling alley, which starts a theme of violence that follows the group throughout. But then, we get to see how rude and vulnerable Blanche really is. She is not hesitant to let out rude comments, and that rudeness is her main character flaw when the audience is introduced to her.
You're just as plump as a little partridge. It's so becoming to you, too. Yes, it is, or I wouldn't say it. You just have to watch around the hips a little.
What are you doing in that horrible place? Oh, what am I saying? I didn't mean to say that. I meant, what kind of a bed is this? One of those collapsible things? Feel all right? Oh, wonderful, honey. I don't...
However, we cannot help but recognize in these scenes that her temperament is volatile and her state is fragile.
I was on the verge of lunacy almost, so Mr. Graves is the high school superintendent. Thank you. He suggested I...
Blanche's vulnerability in these scenes reminds me directly of the way de Beauvoir describes the idea of having traditional femininity in a male-dominated society in her intro to The Second Sex. She states, "Every female human being is not necessarily a woman. To be so considered, she must share in that mysterious and threatened reality known as femininity." Blanche's entrance both physically and thematically seems mysterious. She appears out of the smoke in a new place. Additionally, the literary convention of a new person comes to town is mysterious and foreshadowing in and of itself. And her threatened reality is very present by the way she seems so fearful in her state of being lost and alone. But she is not only fearful of her new surroundings, she is almost immediately made to feel threatened by a group of men at the bowling alley.
Stella, I can't...
In her essay entitled The Woman in Love, de Beauvoir identifies this woman who, with the absence of a husband, feels danger at every moment. Blanche's anticipation of violence directly correlates with what our theorist had to say in her era. This quote by de Beauvoir also gets developed with the idea of infidelity, which we have not seen in Blanche's case yet, but something tells me de Beauvoir might have a beat on Blanche. Our sources on the film agree with the 1950s feminine conventions identified by de Beauvoir when they identify the scene of Blanche breaking down later in the apartment. Jasmine Crittenden, in her essay on the film, writes, "Suddenly, the well-dressed, articulate, beautiful Southern belle is on the verge of breakdown."
Up at a hotel. I'm not going to put up at a hotel. I've got to be near you, Stella. I've got to be with people. I can't be alone because as your husband noticed, I'm not very well.
It is safe to say we can identify an expository understanding of Blanche, but let's meet her sister and our host during this stay. We are first introduced to Stella when she greets Blanche, and immediately the conversation moves away from Stella. She is given almost nothing in her first scene, except for the infatuation with her husband, Stanley. From this moment on, anytime these two women are alone, they are almost exclusively talking about Stanley or his friend Mitch. Mitch and Blanche have their own unique storyline, but we won't quite have time for that today. But even in writing the script to this video essay, conversation around Stella quickly loses focus to the other characters in the movie. This is intentional. This is the role of the subordinate wife. She proves in her exposition that she is truly and utterly attached to Stanley through everything.
He's on the road a good deal. When we travel, go. I mean, then I can hardly stand it when he's away for a night. Stella, he's away for a week and he'll nearly go wild. Gracious. When he comes back, cry in his lap like a baby. Well, I guess that's what's meant by being in love. Decorated 4 times. You had those on when you met him? Surely I wasn't just blinded by all the brass.
Simone de Beauvoir alludes to this crushing reality in Intro to the Second Sex when she states, "Man can think of himself without woman, she cannot think of herself without man." In The Woman in Love, she identifies Blanche's hesitance at Stella's idea of infatuated love when she states, "The word love has by no means the same sense for both sketches."
I guess that's what's meant by being in love.
Stella's idea of Stanley can now also be identified as what de Beauvoir calls dependence. Now, just as we are starting to understand Stella, the story takes the emphasis off of her completely. Why? Well, the third member of our crew is coming home, and he is a blue-collar man, and he has been out drinking and bowling. And he is Marlon Brando, or as we know him, Stanley. As I just mentioned, Stanley is a hard-working 50s manly man. He works and he drinks. And he is staring directly at Blanche's body, isn't he? He is very controlling around Blanche when he meets her and really looks at her a lot. De Beauvoir would call this objectification of women to be their role as sexual beings for men. He also looks directly down at her when they first meet him. This is him establishing control. This is more of a note for Blanche, but she also is being flirtatious towards him. But he is also involved with her in elements of infidelity thoughts. De Beauvoir called this. De Beauvoir identifies Stanley as a working-class man who has the courageous inclination towards transcendence, endeavors to extend his grasp on the world. He is ambitious. He acts. Now, it seems as though as we have some de Beauvoirian ideas in these characters, and some storylines have started, but what happens when everyone is settled and crammed in this little apartment for just one night? What is the worst that could happen? The ladies are arriving home, and they find a group of men playing poker, and immediately their presence is unwelcome with Stanley, who embarrasses Stella. Now, the women relocate to a different room. This sets up the de Beauvoirian idea of thus humanity is male and man defines woman as relative to him. The splitting up in the small apartment sets it up the way that it best fits Stanley, and Stanley wants the women away from him. The dynamic of this house is based on where women are in relation to Stanley. Speaking of Stanley, I'm sure him losing in poker and being extremely drunk won't make him do anything rash and violent. This is not the end of the night for any of our characters. After getting a cold shower, Stanley decides he is going to win Stella back by moaning her name as loud as he can. But for some reason this works, and Stella takes him back. We find out the next morning why that is.
The garbage, what? Why? I've been half crazy, Stella. How could you come back in this place like that?
Very ashamed of himself.
And that makes it all right?
No. My slippers and rushed about the place smashing the light bulbs with it.
He did what?
He smashed all the light bulbs with the unit.
I was sort of thrilled, but...
So it seems like Stella doesn't mind at all that he smashed his thing. She actually sort of likes his smashing. She is also very easily swayed by his pity when he breaks into sobs, as Ram Narayan describes in her essay. Ram Narayan also mentions the sensual, loud whack on Stella's thigh, and his changing after Stella and the poker night are acts that conform to the spirit of patriarchal ideology. When talking to Blanche the next morning, Stella is completely fine. She is even almost glowing, showing how stuck to Stanley she truly is. Something that adds on to this layer is a small concept from Joseph Silvia's essay on the psychoanalytic aspects of their relationships, stating, "and whom she cannot leave because of her sexual needs for him, and because she is about to have his baby." This fact adds another layer of complication to the story, in which de Beauvoir might have a lot to say as well, but we don't quite have time for that. More importantly, de Beauvoir has two crucial pinpoint connections to Stella's situation with her abuser. When describing the woman in love, she states she chooses to desire her enslavement so ardently that it will seem to her the expression of her liberty, religion. Also, she states during a more or less lengthy crisis, sometimes for life, she will make herself a voluntary victim. She will struggle furiously to hurt her ego that has been unable to gratify him to the full. At this point, her attitude is genuinely masochistic. While this statement by de Beauvoir might come under criticism today as some form of victim blaming, she certainly raises interesting points about Stella.
I was sort of thrilled, but...
Now we move on to the final significant event to measure between these characters. While we were busy talking about Stella, Stanley is making trouble. While Stella is occupied, Blanche is alone in the house with Stanley. The scene of Blanche's rape is one that displays the power dynamic of this era. He was able to do whatever he wanted during each and every scene we had to view so far. But these were not things he needed to do, but he acted and did them anyway, because of his power over the situation. De Beauvoir describes this when she says man has no need for the unconditioned devotion he claims, nor the idolatrous love that flatters his vanity. The devotion he pays no mind to is that of Stella's, and the love that flatters his fancy is that of Blanche. Blanche's situation in this scene is described as in Crittenden essay on the movie. Her dalliances and flirtations are driven not only by egotism and vanity, but also by the metaphysical desire to fend off death. But as Crittenden mentions, this is for her survival. While the second she is alone with Stanley in any of these scenes, it always seems as though she is in immense danger. And she is, for even after this scene, Blanche is told that she is crazy and is taken to a mental hospital, away from the family. So after her rape scene, she has nothing to say, and in my researching what some older articles think of the story, I found Anka Vlaspoulos' article that states, Blanche's fall from authority, her subjugation is masterfully captured by Williams and her being turned over to the supreme authority in charge of language. In this quote, she is referring to psychiatry, and in the literary sense referring to the audience getting the final word on Blanche. Blanche no longer gets to speak for herself, even though she is the victim in this situation. She is sent off and left for the audience to judge. In our pursuit of finding de Beauvoirian ideas manifested in contemporary characters of her time, I think that we have found an answer. Her theory points at many of the same problems that women face in their story and identifies their roles in society. Stanley is also very easily described by de Beauvoir. It took many years for her awareness of gender roles and problematic patriarchal actions to be adopted by those that are around her. Anyway, I hope we all found this to be a helpful thought experiment. If you have any ideas of your own about this movie, de Beauvoir, or anything else, feel free to leave a comment below. Thank you so much for watching.